had a chance to walk around the grounds here, be sure and do it before you leave, because it's super exemplary what they're doing with both edibles and native plants. And I won't get a chance to say this on the panel, I want to say it now. For those of you who still believe in evangelism, having a community garden and native landscaping at your church is one of the most awesome forms of the church's evangelism, showing the gospel to the neighborhood. And every church can be a demonstration project. So, way to go, Mountainside. Good stuff. Helps to have city funding.
So as we draw this gathering to a close, we wanted to have some time for conversation with our presenters. And we're going to start with an invitation to the presenters to ask one another a few questions. And then we're going to open it up for all of you. And so I'm going to try to get to everyone and pass the microphone so that we can all be heard. But I want to start with inviting Sylvia to offer a question to Hannah, and then we're gonna kind of go along in a kind of round robin style, and then I'll have one closing pair of questions for the presenters at the end.
Okay, thanks, Reagan. Hannah, I've been reflecting a lot on the way you ended your paper from Psalm 27. I have seen the goodness of the Lord in the land. I believe I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And I'm wondering if you can just give us examples of where you have seen that, where you have seen in the midst of kind of, especially a country that is so depleted of natural areas as England is. Where are those places that you're seeing healing and restoration, and the goodness of the Lord happening?
Thank you. Yeah, when we were having our circle time yesterday and we were reflecting on what gives us hope in the place we are, I kind of didn't hear the second part of the question, but what I answered was that what gives me hope is that when I see a reminder of the potential for humans to change their mind, right, that we're recipients of grace, and through grace we are capable of transformation, that we can turn from our sin, we can turn from the ways we've mistreated the world and choose something different. And there are genuinely, we are surrounded by examples of that, not being conformed to the pattern of this world, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. And in my own context, a recent story that I find encouraging is the return of beavers to England. They're thriving. They were such a prominent part of English cultural heritage that at one point the Catholic Church agreed that beavers were fish so they could be eaten on a Friday. So they've sadly they got eaten almost to extinction, but they've been reintroduced, and the transformation of the landscape that they've performed in areas that are meant to be wetland areas and helping to mitigate flooding in other areas is remarkable. And another story I quickly want to tell about that kind of the reminder that also our ecosystems are kind of graced in that they are forgiving. If we give them a chance, they will recover. They will return to how they're meant to be. So in Scotland, there's a project where they've reintroduced wild boar. Now, I don't know, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with robins and the friendliness of robins towards humans, and the fact that robins will land in your garden and follow you around. And the reason for that is that robins evolved in partnership with wild boar, because wild boar would rootle around, dig up the soil, and uncover insects that robins would then eat. So when wild boar were wiped out in the UK, robins sort of turned their attention to humans as kind of glorified pigs who would do the same job of digging up the soil and revealing insects for them to eat. And what happened when they reintroduced wild boar into an area of Scotland that hadn't seen them for hundreds of years was within a couple of hours, robins flew down from the trees and began following them through the woods. That relationship had not been forgotten. That relationship was restored. Grace was at work. And so I think we can be encouraged that it will become more challenging to do this work the longer we leave it, but there is grace in the world that we've been gifted, and we can see that restoration.
Thank you, Hannah. And now I invite you to offer a question to Jonathan.
To Jonathan, I was just saying to Jonathan, I kind of scribbled down a page of notes about the question that I'm not going to read the page. But I wanted to, I tried to clarify down what I was thinking about, and it's this question of thinking about the extinction of humanity. And it almost builds on what I've just been talking about in terms of our belief in grace being present in God's world. And my question is about what kind of moral imagination is created with a narrative around human extinction. So we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Human extinction is one live possibility. There are a range of other futures that might lie ahead of us. One of the things I'm concerned with is the moral imagination that follows the story we tell about the future ahead of us. And that would be one of my concerns with human extinction, that it encourages a kind of nihilism or, in the case of population control rhetoric, whereby you almost have an anthropophobia that targets the poorest that emerges. So that's my kind of question to you is how do you see the moral imagination of human extinction playing out, and how does that fit with kind of visions of grace or the possibility of change?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And it's absolutely a question of imagination. So to imagine the end of humanity is a thought experiment. It's an act of imagination. And to ask, if we considered the end of humanity, if we thought the world would end, would that no longer motivate good action? Well, only if you think the only reason you do something good is from some consequential end, which of course isn't and can't possibly be the case. Lots of things we do because we think they're good. We don't, the calculus of consequence isn't part of the story. Kant was really good on this. He said the reason you can't think consequentially is it presumes too much about your ability to predict the future. So, and Aristotle said, if you don't do it because it's good in of itself, it's a little bit less good. And so lots of things we do because we think they're good things. This is one of the most powerful parts of the hospice metaphor, I gather. One of the things I teach is bioethics, and we do a lot with hospice in the class because we don't want the students, they're all headed to medical school, and their thinking is, I will only be with a patient insofar as I can do something for her. If I can't do anything for her, I don't need to be around, which all of us who have spent time in hospice, the one people you don't see there are doctors. And that's an absolute tragedy of the profession, which medicine was initially about being hospitable, being present with people. So, the thought experiment is really the thought experiment about how we understand our motivations. And then the really interesting question, like the notion that nature shot through with grace. So one part of the thought experiment is to say, if humans aren't part of the resurrection story, how else do we imagine the resurrection story? What I want us to do is move away from understanding resurrection like creation as simply human-centric. And so it's a thought experiment, but it's certainly the case that we could think of the future not simply in terms of the human. We could think of it more like Scranton thinks, not the human per se, but human civilization as we know it. And that's also a good thought experiment, right? Because there's a great article this morning in CNN, we can't AC the whole world. So the argument was that right now, as climate ticks up, most of our response is just to turn on the AC higher. But the problem is, not everyone can do that because there's about 1 billion people without access to electricity, much less AC. But if all those people did have AC, it would exacerbate the problem. So what the person was saying is, if you think about the end of AC, it forces the imagination to consider other ways of organizing our society, rather than one of haves and have-nots. And if you have the AC, then you're good, and if you don't, you're screwed or something like that. So I think it's absolutely a case And what I love most about your work is this notion of naming is the attempt to lean into the grace structure of creation. Because creation is all grace, right? The idea is, I mean, you're a theologian, the idea is that God did not need to create. It's all gratuity, it's all grace. So how do we lean into the non-instrumental reality of creation, creaturely life? Naming is the act of participating in that. So, yeah, so, thanks. So I was thinking about my question for Chet. I mean, Chet is such an amazingly nuanced and subtle thinker, and I've just been really edified and challenged. Like I have so many thoughts. So in thinking about a question, I thought, well, I could, you know, pick Chet's brain all day and just ask him about what he thinks about this, that, and the other. So I was like, which one? So if you can indulge me, I'm going to actually ask about something a little bit far afield from some of the stuff we've been talking about, and the indulgence part is to take it more into my neck of the woods. So as many of you know, I'm, among other things, I'm a college administrator. So I'm an associate dean, or as my wife says, I'm an ass dean. Which I like to say my ultimate aspiration is to be an associate provost, so I could be an ass pro. But one version of the question I want to ask you, Chad, but then I'll ask, I think, a better version. One version I want to ask you is, do you think universities and colleges are part of the solution or part of the problem? I don't really want to ask you because I'm pretty sure the answers were part of the problem. And I mean that both ironically in a funny way, but I seriously mean that. Now that, you know, as I say now as an administrator, I don't simply know how the sausage is made. I take part in making the sausage. And universities have been absolutely undercut by the same commodification of knowledge and labor as every other part of the university. I mean, every part of the consumer economy. But I think my more hopeful question for my brother is something like this. What hope do you have for the university and colleges at this point? Or if you were a good friend of an administrator, what would you tell that administrator, you know, what would you tell that administrator, you all absolutely need to do this. This will actually help us. So this, I mean, if I can ask you to indulge that question. Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks everybody for being so patient in listening. You've done a lot of listening in these 3 days. We actually, a big part of our work is trying to figure out how to work with universities and seminaries. And so, you know, it is very much part of our vocation to wrestle with the question that you're asking. When we talk about seminary, sanctuary, streets, and soil, it really is a vision of integration, of drawing on the strengths, but figuring out how we can do more cross-training between those spheres. In a lot of ways, university or the seminary is very much like the church in the sense of if they didn't exist, we'd have to reinvent them because they serve an important role of curating and chronicling and animating imagination, all those things, teaching technical skills like learning Greek or Hebrew. So this is a question that we've pondered a lot. Most of my energy when I decided not to go the PhD route but work more in popular education, most of my energy has gone into building alternative spaces for pedagogy, which you know our hope would be more integral, and we did that through Word and World Schools and through our own institute, which also made me an administrator of those spaces, and in a very small scale. I understand the
Share my pain.
I do. I mean, it's challenging just logistically to get people into a room and resourced well enough to do the work they need to do. And so, you know, we've kind of been working outside of the university in an attempt to do. You know, I'm very influenced by Freire and popular education as building a culture of cultural power for transformation, as Freire says. But the academic industrial complex is real, and when we can have partnerships, that's the best of all worlds. So Norman Gottwald, I don't know if that's a name familiar to some of you. He's probably the most significant Hebrew Bible scholar of his generation. And when he, his own academic career was to seek the low places. So at the height of his fame, when Union Theological Seminary wanted to woo him, he instead went to New York Theological Seminary, which is working class pastors of color. So he made really awesome choices in his professional career. But when he retired, he put all his energy into helping us build alternative theological spaces. And he knew that by him showing up to our spaces, that gave a certain credibility. And so, by the same token, so when there can be that kind of partnership across institutional lines, I think that's a win-win for everybody. Conversely, we always used to say with both universities and seminaries, we need to work on breaking down the walls of insularity, and particularly trying to get community activists and people with stories, hospice workers and community organizers and felons from nonviolent direct action to be welcome in the classroom at a tertiary institution. In the 60s, which I was not part of, I was the generation that followed the 60s, so kind of got all their exhaust. But one of the powerful reasons why social movements were strong in the 60s is because there was this synergy between the academy and social movements. Social movements were welcome they were brought onto campus, and that leavened the pedagogic process on campus. That really has atrophied steadily ever since, and it became more and more difficult to have access to the classroom, to students. It became more and more difficult for students to go out and do internships in social movements and community organizations. Part of that being the economic structural adjustment of tertiary education, and the political economy of debt and so on. So how do we rebuild that? Now I feel like we are in a moment where that is starting to rebuild, and I think the movements around Gaza are one little indication of collaboration across. So, I guess the short answer is whatever you can do from your space inside that institution to build and not just encourage, but to incentivize those kinds of partnerships, to make sure that students can get credit for doing work off campus, and opening classrooms for activists to come and sit in and receive as well as offer. Right, that's organic, and then work at the policy level as an administrator to make that happen. My life changed as a young activist when we were living in an intentional community in the East Bay, and we heard that Norman Gottwald was coming to town. He was at the height of his fame. He'd just published Tribes of Yahweh, which changed the whole field of Hebrew Bible studies. We knew about it. We all trooped up to the Graduate Theological Union to hear him give his talk. It was a seminar. We weren't invited. And there we were in the back row, 6 of us. Yeah, we get to hear Norman Gottwald. And he walks up to us and he just welcomes us as if we belonged in that seminar. And then he proceeded to talk and dialogue with us. And then he handed out copies of his next book, which is before social media, right? So they're actually hard copies, Xeroxed, And I just said, this is a people scholar, this is what we need. He didn't need to leave the academy to do that. He just had to act in a way that was hospitable. We are also very critical of social movement folk because we don't spend enough time in critical reflection and analysis. We're just all about, doing the next thing. And so I've got a whole nother critique on that side of the fence, which is why we need the common spaces and the integration. Yeah, thanks. That's a great topic. So I don't know whether folks heard the news that Patty is working on a book. And my funny question to you, Patty, is when is the book coming out? My serious question is, what do you think you need as a young artist and theologian and activist, someone who's very integral in, which is what impressed me so much in hearing you and seeing your work. What do you think you need seriously from old farts like many of us on the panel to be encouraged, to find ways that your voice is heard in, frankly, in an environment that is so much more complicated to be heard in than when I was growing up. There's just so much static in social media and so on. And I know you think about that a lot as an artist and a theologian. What can this community do to support you in taking your voice seriously and putting it out there in all the ways that you feel called to do?
My first answer to your second question is that I would like to thank Deborah for inviting me to be here and do this. I think that that's, Deborah has a kind of like very quiet approval and support that has been like, it kind of set me up over the whole year to have the like confidence to be able to come and share things. Having never really done that outside of my university space that I felt very comfortable in. So thank you, Deborah. And beyond that, I think really it's about relationships, and I'm very glad to have met you and all the other people up here and out there, because I think that, I come from a very small, quirky world and congregation that has many gifts, but knowing about how to be in a public-facing artist or writer, thinker, not really one of the things we know how to do. And EP is one of our kind of connections to that world. So I guess I am seeking for relationships, probably rather like the kind that you were talking about to Jonathan, about kind of integrating different spaces of activism and theology, and for me, the arts. I think I can have all kinds of hesitations about whether artists can be very arrogant about how important we are and that we can change the world. I don't think that that's, I think rather, I think what Hannah's talked about and Jonathan too, about doing things because they're good and because it builds relationship, feels like a more hopeful thing for me at the moment than even though, well, because I think because of relationships to people like you guys who I'm meeting here, then in relationship there's actually possibility for transformation, which I really do believe in, but I don't think it necessarily comes in the form of a really awesome, which I would like to do, gallery exhibition, but like, yeah. And then in terms of, well, and so I guess something that I can ask from you all is to stay in contact and to teach me how to do the kinds of things that you've done, because I honestly have no idea how it's done to have a voice, despite being educated in art and creative writing. Still don't really understand how those worlds, work in terms of the kind of public-facing part of it. So yeah, let's be friends. I guess that's my answer. And then my answer to when the book's coming out, well, Ched decided that I'm writing a book, so I suppose, which is actually something that I've always wanted to do, although I feel too young for it right now. But then books always take many, many years to write, so I'm sure by the time that it hopefully happens and is finished. He goes, so when do you want your book accountability project to contact you after this? And I was like, well, I'm starting a new job and getting married and stuff, so maybe a bit after that. But yes, I mean, it would be wonderful to continue to be friends with everybody here and to have your support, and I have immense respect for all of you. My question for Sylvia is that I really appreciated the way that, many things about your preaching. One of them is you have a very rich sensory descriptions that really feel like they slow time down and that I'm kind of in these sensory moments with you. And then you also talked about, and this is a phrase that Chet also used, like apprenticing ourselves to creation other than human creation. And and also I noticed that you call humans the servants, the earth creatures, the servants of the earth. And so I was wondering if you could share some of the non-human creatures that delight you and that have taught you things from home.
How much time do we have? Yeah, that's a great question, and just that to make a comment. Well, a comment on the servants of creation. I've been reflecting lately about how, so we live on a permaculture farm in central Ontario. We rotationally graze cattle in the summer, just 6 cows, so we know their names, and talk to them every day. And I've been reflecting on how other creatures serve the earth as well as human creatures. And one of the central tenets of permaculture is that animals are the only way that nutrients moves uphill. And because I live in a rural environment that's depleted of wildlife, there aren't enough wild creatures to move nutrients uphill. So our cows partner with us in our farm slopes down about 60. There's about a 60-yard drop from the top where the house is to the back of the property, and a lot of that is woods. But the part that isn't, our cows are part of the way that the earth is served by another creature on our property, just like beavers do a function of serving creation as well. But I also, I spend a lot of time photographing insects. If it had been raining, which, it's California, unlikely, but if it had been raining, I actually have a slideshow with insects that I thought, I could just do that for our morning thing. And discover, looking at just these teeny hoverflies and the teeny sweat bees and the minor bees, which are, when you see, we're all used to sort of noticing bumblebees and honeybees, which are actually invasive species, but the heavy lifting of pollination, of ensuring that the cycle of life continues, is done by these minuscule little creatures. These minuscule little bees and flies, and you'll notice the hoverflies because they're the ones who actually hover, right? You see them darting. It's hard to see them because they move so fast. But their role in ensuring that that life continues, that plants continue, that there's nectar and pollen for other insects, their role in being food for larger insects and for birds. All of that is just this beautifully calibrated relationship that you see if you're paying attention to the teeniest things in creation. And so I think part of what that has taught me is the small things actually really do count. These small little acts of ensuring that fertility continues, these small little acts of being the ones who act in such a way that that our actions enable the flourishing of other creatures, whether that be the soil or the flowers or the insects. That's how creation, I was going to say it's meant to be. That's how the narrative of creation unfolds in life-giving ways. And if we want to be part of that narrative, I think we learn that from these tiny little creatures that most of us don't even notice and would be happy if they were gone because they give us the creeps, or we're scared of being stung, or we don't want to have to be slapping ourselves the whole time we're outside because we're getting eaten by them. So that's just one little bit.
Well, thank you all, and I want to invite us other questions from the group. If anyone has something for our presenters.
I have a question for Ched. Ched, in reflecting on your article, one of the things that I was thinking about is that I think I have a very, well, I've been being converted over many years from a very individualistic perspective to a more collective perspective, but it made me wonder if I still have a pretty individualistic idea of what repentance is. And I would really love to hear you talk about like collective repentance from an individual, like how does an individual participate in collective repentance, especially around climate crisis stuff? Because I feel like I'm just lost in what, and I feel like I just end up in a kind of guilt that's just not useful for anything. So I'd love to hear you reflect on that. And I really liked what you were saying about addiction model, because I think that really plays into what I'm looking for.
Thanks. Yeah, you know, the strongest thing about the addiction model is that it is community-based. Recovery is a indivisibly communal undertaking in the 12-step movement. I think, you know, it's a huge question, because what you feel and what all of us feel is a socialized sense of identity. Individualism, privatization of consciousness is it's the air we breathe, it's the milk we drink in this culture. So it's very difficult to begin to violate and transcend. But it is actually, collective action is more deeply wired into our anthropology than individualism. If we can work on, you know, moving through the static in our heads. So I think the easiest or the most readily available transition is to think about individual actions that are meaningful to you, and then ask, how might I communitize these? Like, if it's around food, or if it's around energy, or if it's around housing, to name three really key issues. The choices that you are stepping into and feeling empowered and animated to do, can you collectivize that with friends, with members of the church? We were talking about this just a few minutes at the break. Um, so that now you've got a food club that cooks together and talks about food and talks about food justice. Or you have an EV collective, which is working on advocacy for better access to plugging in, that is educating yourselves on, on the problematic lithium industrial complex around the world. Because then you're not having to shoulder it all yourselves. You're all, we're talking about the break. In our work, we talk about the work of what we call a Sabbath economics community is to deprivatize anxiety so that we're not all just gripping about all these issues alone and just getting eaten alive by it. But we're actually realizing that we all share these concerns. We all share these anxieties. We all share this socialized ignorance and so on. And that right, that takes the pressure off. It's like sinners are supposed to be welcome in church because, hey, we're all sinners here. We kind of lost that, but anyway, it's still a good idea. So it's deprivatizing anxiety, which is no small thing in our society. And it's collectivizing imagination because you're going to have gone farther and deeper in something, and somebody else is going to have done it. You always can pick up the phone and ask Sylvia about insects. She'll tell you. And that's a step to move from kind of relatively isolated responses, which the society will encourage because they're easily crushed, to more collective. And if it's a collective of 4 of you, that's okay. That's a great start. And then, of course, from there, you can figure out how to multiply that communitizing spirit, and that's how movements are born. So this has been... Sure. Yeah, and who knew? That's actually what the church is founded on, is that notion. Is that we never stop being sinners saved by grace. How did we lose that? And 12-step is one example of how the Spirit has resurrected old wisdom to mirror back to the church, that it's actually being practiced down in the basement by the 12-step group while everybody up in the congregation is virtue signaling their piety. So I just would really encourage you. There's lots more to be said, obviously, but starting by honoring your individual leadings, but then asking yourself, who else is drawn to this, and how could we start doing it together? And boy, that just unleashes all kinds of interesting energy. Anybody else want to?
I think part of the reason why we find this so hard is that we've read the biblical story as a story about our individual relationships with God. And from start to finish, it's a story about creating a community where God can feel at home, right? And, God didn't call Abraham and say, Abraham, I'm calling you into this new place because I'd like to have a warm and personal relationship with you. I'm calling you to be the start of this community where healing and blessing is going to come to all earth creatures, all the families of the earth, which includes animals. And so I think that's something that, I think it would be easier to think, to have an imagination shaped by community if our preaching and our teaching and our Bible studies were fundamentally thinking about that as well, and not that individual relationship with God all the time.
I also think there are people, wherever you are, who are already doing a lot of work for the earth, for others. There are also human creatures who are already doing it. Look for them. Often those groups are not Christian. I think sometimes we have an arrogance that we are the primary demonstration plot. and we have a human arrogance that humans are the primary stewards or masters, right? So I think some of the places I've found the most beauty and encouragement have been at the popular universities for Gaza, and in these other kind of social movements that are like, they're not Christian-led, but they often have, there are Christians there, and there are Muslims there, and there are a lot of different people from many faiths or from no faith, and who care about the earth and want to be earth creatures. So I would say don't just stick to things that say Jesus, because Jesus is present amongst far further, I think, than we like to look.
Yeah. I don't want to just drag out this response time, but just one sort of practical reflection on changing behavior and how that takes place. Virtue is not spontaneous, right? Like, I think we really want the conversion story where we just see the light and then we just radically change our whole lifestyles overnight, and then we are kind of new people. And that's not how the Christian tradition has understood the way that virtue works at all. Virtue is formed of habits that take time, and also habits are better formed in communities. So the church traditionally is meant to be a kind of a space of habitual virtue learning, and that we do that together. And so when it comes to kind of feelings of guilt and feelings of being complicit, it is that kind of one small step at a time, not because we're trying to say that the only thing we can do is small steps, but because virtuous life requires habit making, and so we are going to fail over and over again. The muscle has to be strengthened, whatever the new thing is that we want to do, or whatever the change we want to make is. But we just have to keep practicing the same thing over and over again, and it kind of comes back in a way to Jonathan's point about human stupidity. And our failure in this, that if we are trying to change a habit, it will maybe take years for us to really embody a new way of living and not fall back into old ways of doing things. So I guess it's a question of also patience with ourselves, and looking for people who can support us in forming new habits. So voicing the new habit that you want to form with other people is quite a helpful first step, and that's part of like the 12-step model as well, that you voice the change that you're trying to make, and then others hold you accountable. But yeah, so like think of it as habit forming, because we are just going to fail over and over again when we try and change things.
A lot of us in the room are involved in some way or other with education, and education is one of those things that tends to take people from their places and supply them with some kind of knowledge or learning, and then direct them to other places. And we're not the only ones that do that, but we do it. So my question for any of you is, one, do you have any wisdom for those of us in education to help return people to their places, or to help people learn from their places? Or another way to get at the question is, what have you learned from your places, as opposed to what you've learned in an educational institution that has been transformative for you?
I feel like I need to learn from
I went to public schools my whole life in my neighborhood, within a few blocks of where I live, in the southeast corner of the city. They're the kind of schools that either nobody knows that they exist, or they have a kind of not so great reputation. I had a great time in those schools. The primary thing that I learned was, how we learned to read and write and think was sometimes a little bit lacking, to be fair. But what I learned was, I was surrounded by students whose lives and families were variously different from mine in variously different ways. And because of the way that the school was, I was constantly being asked to teach them and for them to teach me. And it's because of those kids and that public education that's why I want to return home. And there's a lot of wisdom, I think, amongst like in those kind of public schools. At the same time, I think that we were being formed into like being a very kind of tight community, especially in my high school, where we learned to support all kinds of kids, even when originally maybe we, were prejudiced against each other. That's kind of a light word for the kind of meanness or violence that can spring out of bigger social problems, especially poverty. But at the same time, at my graduation, they made us say the oath of my high school, which had the little phrase, I vow to like be upwardly mobile. Not joking, like the words upward mobility were in there. And like, I felt like my church and my parents spent my whole life teaching me that I should be downwardly mobile. So, and that, because, that's where God is. God is in the earth, and God is with the oppressed. God is the oppressed. But then at the same time, it was like I always had this very conflicting feeling of like, well, you can't totally say that to people who have a much more difficult life than me. But I also felt like we were each other's, way out. But the way out was to remake the neighborhood together. So I don't know. That's just me sharing about what my awesome public, awesome but also difficult, and awesome because it was difficult public education taught me. And so I encourage people to be involved in your public schools and with their teachers and their unions and those kids.
So talk about how you had a vision for your farm as a laboratory, as a school.
Yeah, I mean, I've got so many things going through my mind in answer to this question. Well, one thing we've done with our farm is over the past 19 years, we've had, with a few years where we didn't do this, we've had approximately 26 now young people come through for the summer. So anywhere from 1 to, well, one summer we had 9 people. That was a little crazy. Well, no, actually we had 5, but it seemed like more. Have people come for the summer. We called them internships, but really they were learning experiences. So over the course of the summer, people would learn about how to be deeply rooted in a place, how to grow food, how to interact with the animals on our farm, how, well, it's really interesting actually. One student wrote about our farm at the beginning of her master's, and it was probably the nicest thing anybody has ever written about me, because she talked about, asking me what things were for. So, how come we're not planting that area? She said, and Sylvia said, well, that's where the snakes live. So we just leave that area for the snakes, and various other things. Why are you planting this? Well, that's for these insects like this. And then, it kind of ended with her saying, and why do we plant calendula? And I said, because they're for the gardener. They're also for the insects, but they're for the gardener. I love them and we'll eat them, and yeah. But but teaching people that, like how every piece of what happens on this land is for other creatures on the land and serves other creatures, and then people learn how to harvest the food and how to preserve the food, how to can the food. People learn how to eat together. Eating together is central. So what does it look like to be in community together, to live with people who are hard? It's a little easier because it's only 4 months, so you kind of know it's going to end at the end of 4 months. That if Ched's really getting up my nose, he'll be leaving, so that's okay. I can put up with it for a bit, but still, it's. I have that longer view. For younger people, that's actually harder. 4 months is a long time. And we do theological and biblical reflection, a lot of that. How does this all fit together? And what has been happening, some of those young people have just gone back to their places, and carried on their lives in ways that I'm sure are less obvious in how the experience shaped them. Some are running, inner city urban farms in Toronto. A number are doing that, and in Vancouver. Others are the ones who organize their community gardens in their places. All of them, I think, how they raise their children has been fundamentally different. It's been downward mobility. And essentially that's what we're teaching, downward mobility for the people who come, because we're off grid, we're solar powered, we don't have a lot of appliances, we have sawdust toilets. So, if you think that that's gross, you're not gonna probably make it all summer long. And But there's another piece too, in terms of educational institutions, Julian, that I've been thinking a lot about. And Jonathan, this pertains to your question too. I don't know how this could possibly happen, but just in terms of thinking about our curriculum and how our curriculum needs to be more deeply grounded in our places, and just in creation in general, right? So, when we're teaching homiletics classes, what does creation look like that actually what does preaching look like, but imagines the voice of creation as part of that preaching? What does our liturgy look like that imagines the voice of creation as part of our liturgy? How do we do, systematic theology? How do we do theology and get rid of the systematic bit? How do we do theology from below, but not just from the perspective of the poor, but from below that bubbles up from the suffering of creation as well. And that isn't a niche, that isn't contextual theology, it's just theology, right? It's white male theology is generally just called theology, and everything else is contextual. This should not be the way it is. So just systematically going through our disciplines and asking how each of these can be more attentive to the voice of creation, and all of this can be more integrated. Part of the problem is also the ivory tower character of each discipline. That's not the word, but the way we've separated all our disciplines. There's nothing integral, whereas this world is nothing but integral. And by not looking at it that way, we've created an education that kind of limps along, which I think is why people love this gathering, right? All kinds of people who are doing different kinds of things, and all these ecotones of cross-fertilization happening. Anyway, I could say a lot more about that.
Very, very quickly off the back of that, we've lost the tradition in theological education of monastic communities of ora et labora, right? Seminarians don't do any work, not with their hands, and that deeply concerns me as a model for teaching what it means to be in ministry. And so we might imagine for a moment what it would be like if every seminary had a small community garden that every student was required to spend some time working in over their education. That it wasn't an opt-in thing, it was part of the compulsory curriculum of even 2 or 3 hours of getting their hands dirty and participating in that project. Yeah.
Wesley School of Theology in Ohio has done exactly that. Princeton has experimented with a farminary. So this is beginning to happen, and these are important experiments. And they lead to the other strategy. I mean, one strategy is to relocate critical pedagogy away from insular academic institutions, but the other strategy is to work on replacing the institutions that exist and say, actually, you are in a place. How can you start surfacing the placeness of where you are? So Elaine and I are working with Garrett Theological Seminary in north of Chicago on doing a decolonization storyboard that's public across campus, that's telling the native history of that place and the colonial history of that place, so that you can no longer walk around campus without actually having to hear the story the land holds, which has been silenced for so long. You know, that's a really small, low-budget step, but the implications for what it means to inhabit that campus, I think are profound. So these are small steps that can be very meaningful, either of you know, two different kinds of replacing education, both in its place and elsewhere.
I was talking about this last night with Erin and Therese too, or Therese. I've started, I do all my teaching online now, which means people stay in their places. Now this is non-credit, popular level education. A lot of clergy are in my classes. But part of what we do is precisely that, okay? You know, so when we're talking about the biblical story, how is this, how does this story impact where you are placed? What is we always begin with people naming where the territory they're from, the indigenous peoples that they're from, but then constantly looping back, in classes to the places where everybody is coming from, which is across North America, Australia, Korea. There's a bunch of different places people are. But so paradoxically, it's weird because I thought I would hate teaching online. I'm not actually in the same place as any of the people I'm teaching, but everybody is learning more about being placed in a different, you know, more deeply. BibleRemixed.ca if you're interested. BibleRemixed.ca. Yeah, in the fall, it's not up there yet, but I'll be teaching a course on Luke because somebody wrote a really good book on Luke that's coming out this fall, Ched.
So they handed the microphone to me. First, just a word of appreciation. I think it's very risky to set up a panel like this where each person is asking a question of somebody else, and you guys have done it amazingly well. It's great to see people actually attending to each other's projects so carefully. So kudos to that. Having said that, I want to put Hannah on the spot. So answer as much or as little as you would like of this question, but your writing in Words for a Dying World were sort of the first place where I really understood with theological depth the significance of climate grief. So I'm very appreciative of that. And my memory of that is that it's very doxological, that there's a very strong sense in that humans are praying and worshiping creatures. So I wanted to give you a chance, like if you wanted to, you asked Jonathan this interesting question, and he gave this kind of very doxological answer. And so I wonder if you were gonna comment on his response to that kind of living beyond hope specifically means naming, we don't do the things we do for utilitarian or consequentialist or efficiency kind of purposes, we do them for praise. How did that strike you? Is there anything you would want to add to that or comment on it? Because that seemed very important to me. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated Jonathan's response because it brings back to the center the question of what it means to be a human creature. And we've talked a lot about the kind of the problems of obsessing of humans as the kind of be all and end all of the story. But at the same time, you know, we're going to be anthropocentric because we're anthropos, right? Like you can't expect a bee not to be bee-centric. You can't expect a human not to be human-centric. The only experience of the world we have is one of being human. And so it's right that our concern is about how to do that well. And Jonathan's exactly right, that the performance of our humanity is a response to pure gratuity, that we've received gift, and so we offer praise in response. And the tradition of the church that I've drawn most on in relation to that has been the Eastern Orthodox tradition as humans as priests of creation. And that priestly performance is a kind of a vocation which is not because of any kind of particular special skill that humans have, but just the gift of vocation that they've been given, and that if we fail to perform that, then something truly is lost. from what it means to be part of the goodness of creation as a whole. So, you know, the offering of praise and the offering up of the world in prayer can feel very ineffectual because we can't often see material results from that work. And yet it's the work that we've been called to do. And I do believe that it is transformative, both for those who are praying and for the world that they pray into. So yes, it's a priestly ministry that each of us are called to perform in our own ways and in our own places. And the reason that the book took on, in part, a kind of global picture is because there's deep encouragement in the sense of it invites us to give each other courage in remembering that we aren't performing this work alone, but that each of us has a priestly vocation for the place and the time that we've been given, and that other people are doing that vocation in their time and in their place, and that we do not need to perform it for the whole world. So yeah, that's why the book kind of took the shape it did. But thank you, that's a lovely question. And you know, I've written a couple of articles about it. If you want to read more about it, you can, you know, find the academic footnote stuff. But yes, the heart of it is that gift of gratitude that we return for what we've been given.
Well, I know that there is so much in this conversation that we could keep going, but we are also finite and with our time and space together. But I wanted to offer, since this is sort of one of the closing pieces of this gathering, to offer a question, a two-part question for each of you. If you can answer it as concisely as possible, that would be great. But what has this time together called you toward? What are you bringing back to your own communities and places? And then what is your charge or call to us as we leave this gathering? And we can just pass the mic down the row.
Just skip me for.
I think even though I've spent a lot of time watching, thinking about corvids, turkey vultures, you know, these different creatures, there's still I think everything I learn makes me feel like there's so much that I don't know about the place that I'm in, and so much about the way that I live that's just like steeped in bloodshed. The blood of non-human creatures and of other people groups. And it's hard to know how to have practices that feel meaningful and uplifting for me to just kind of be in my world. And so I think something that I when I first started, I knew once I decided to really think about other than human creatures, especially the ones we call animals, that I would become vegetarian. So I avoided thinking about it for a really long time. And then I thought about it, and then I became a vegetarian. And being a vegetarian, and an aspiring vegan, as I say, because we're not there yet, is a practice that I do that's, I think, what Hannah said about personal holiness and that mattering to God is part of how I think about it for myself, because I care what comes into my body, even if I know that abstaining, that also the vegetables that I eat are covered in blood too, in terms of the labor and how they're produced. And there are also, you know, and eating meat, it's a very complicated question, but that's one of the things that has been a very difficult daily habit that also makes you feel very estranged from other people, because you start to feel very, you can feel very judgmental and arrogant in a way that's not helpful, but I think it also comes from a loneliness of especially when I was in New Jersey, because it's there's, you know, you can eat pancakes pretty much at most restaurants. Yeah. Anyway, and then another practice that I would like to be more disciplined about is not driving unless there's really a good reason to, which now that I've been gifted, very generously gifted a car by my partner's parents, gifted us a car, then once you have it, it's oh man, you know, it's hard to live the way that I did when I didn't have one. And I was just talking to Hannah yesterday about how if you're a cyclist and that's how you commute, that's a radicalizing thing, because drivers will like try to kill you, it feels like, every day. And it really opens your eyes to, I guess, the addiction to speed and carbon. So that's that's not my call to you, but I would offer those as practices that are at least interesting in terms of how violently people respond to something that you would think would be pretty chill. Not eating meat and not driving a car. Okay. But
Turns out those are the two things that are the core of our culture. And you strip them out and people get angry.
people freak out about bike lanes. They freak out. Anyway, okay. And beef. But my my call for others is that, and as an artist, is I think when we imagine art, you imagine a really brilliant dude. He's standing in front of a painting, and he just has this mastery of the paint, and he uses it, like he manipulates that thing, and he gets it up there, and it's like he's so powerful. He's brilliant. He gets it up there. When you're actually doing the practice of art, and anybody who does it, I think, knows this, it's the materials actually respond to you, and they shape you as much as you shape them. And I think that that's something that we can also practice in our relationship to just materials of all kinds that we're surrounded by, is that when, you know, the air also touches me, I'm also porous, you know, like my dog licks my face, like, and that's true also of materials that we don't think about. And then when that happens, you also feel quite viscerally sometimes how you really damage stuff, and it totally sucks. And that's like even when I'm building something, and it's like, oh, I'm trying to be so careful with this branch that I found somewhere and it was significant, and then I break it, and it's like I have to respond to that I did that to it, but then it also affects me because I was forcing it to do something that it can't do, and that teaches me the branch. So I guess that's like what I would offer to you all, is to let the things of the world affect you rather than always thinking of it as an outward.
Yeah, similarly to Patty, I think the thing I've received over the last few days has been the gift of just the moral clarity of the conversation. It's exhausting to think and talk about climate change and ecological loss and how we need to respond in ordinary life, because the constant the constant cultural narrative is a deliberate muddying of the waters around what is demanded of us at this time, because the reality is so uncomfortable and demands so much of us, and it's very easy to kind of give in to that muddying of the waters and not want to offend, not want to push people further than they feel they can go, allow yourself to be muddied in the process. And I've found the conversation that we've had over the last few days to be so morally clear, and that has been a real gift to me, and a kind of a challenge, a reminder of what we are called to aspire to, even if we constantly fall short. So I've been really grateful for that. My challenge to you all is, go forth and name. But I wanted to just touch briefly in this final moment on the consequences of not naming, and give you a specific example, because naming, I think, beautiful, formative activity, it can become very romantic in the way we think about it. And while I've been here, one of the things that has been distracting me is that I sit on the board of a charity which focuses on church action on climate change. And the focus of our work over the last 20 years has been on divestment, and then what the church does with the things it owns, whether financial or physical. And the project we're working on at the moment is on the land that the Church of England owns. And we've put a huge amount of time and effort into one particular thing, which is finding out the land that the Church of England owns. And it has been extraordinarily difficult because they do not want us to know. And in fact, a few years ago, they didn't even know, in that they hadn't bothered to map it. They just had a lot of stuff. They didn't need to know where it was. They've finally mapped it, and they're refusing to publish that information. And there's plenty of reasons for that they don't want to admit. But the the challenge there is that they are deliberately not naming something so that we cannot name to them what they own and for what they are responsible. So my other challenge to you is go forth and name other creatures, go forth and name your environment, go forth and name your community, but also learn who owns the stuff around you. Learn their names, learn the names of the corporations, the individuals who control that land. And because their names are also part of the narrative. It's not just a romantic story about better relationship with other creatures. It's also a story about learning who is not naming things on purpose. To disguise or distract the rest of us. So that would be the other side of the coin that I want to leave you with. And particularly churches and Christians who own land or own assets and what they are doing with what they kind of probably don't want to publicly name, and where we sit in relation to that.
What I hope to walk away with, I guess it's up to you all more than me, is the very motto of the gathering is friends I didn't know I had. So including these folks here. And Carrie and I were just reflecting last night about how warm this space is. People genuinely wanting to hear your story and to share time with you. When I was a very young academic, Teresa Lysott, who is one of, if not the premier Christian bioethicist in America at least, she said, you know, and I've always looked at Teresa, she said, remember the EP, go to the EP. And that has always been really, really important to me. So one thing I hope I walk away with is friends I didn't know I had. My admonition or encouragement would be, you know, pray and maybe pay that you end up on Sylvia's farm one day as a summer intern. To listen to Sylvia preach is, I have the distinct feeling the times I've heard her preach of walking through a lush and florid field. The Reverend Dr. Malcolm and I share a deep love for language and words and the centrality of it. And the person I've learned the most from on language is Rowan Williams. And he has a wonderful phrase where he says, all of creation is on the way to language. He's not trying to make all creation humans. What he's saying is that creation, insofar as it's shot through with grace, wants to worship. And the utterance of it, whether in forms of silence or verbal utterance or what have you. And I think of that passage when I hear Sylvia preach. It's like walking through a field and she's letting the field, the flowers, the animals speak through her in praise to the Lord. So it's a tremendous gift, you know. And so I felt like I got to be on her farm at least for a day. And I didn't have to pay either, so it was good.
Very quickly. I did write an article about this because I became obsessed with Jesus's microbiome and whether it's raised from the dead. So if you want to read about that, very specific question, there is an article available on that and Irenaeus's understanding, but particularly that the Eucharist is a multi-species event, that our microbiomes participate in receiving the body and the blood. And I think that holds within it an eschatological promise. So just we'll leave it there. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Thanks. I want to echo what Jonathan said about how the last 36, 48 hours has been an experience of weaving of some new community. Academic conferences are built on papers written and delivered. And so often when you hear a person deliver the paper, you learn nothing about that person other than what they already had in their paper. This has been so much more satisfying, having read your papers and then getting to know you just a little bit has just been so much more satisfying. So I take that away, and I hope the EP Circle can take that as a strong affirmation of what you've always tried to be about. My charge to you is my charge to myself. Church is dying. The church is an elder in our culture. It's a dying elder. It's a sick elder. But one of the great treasures that elders have is that they're keepers of the story. And however frail and elderly and even annoying the church may be, it is a keeper of old wisdom. Old wisdom that we need. However our history pans out, we need this wisdom. We're in a moment of a long-running, culminating historical moment of apocalypse. It doesn't look good. But our old stories tell us that our movement was born under the shadow of death. It was true in Egypt. It was true under Rome. And every time the church has been reborn, it has been under the shadow of death. So all of us as people who ourselves have been birthed and nurtured, as well as wounded by the church, I pray that we can return to our singular vocation of being bearers of this old wise story that, as Leslie Silko puts it, stories are all we have to save us from illness and death. We don't have anything if we don't have stories. So they try to make us forget the stories, become confused about them, because then we would be defenseless. Let us be bearers of the story, and through the power of these stories, we can imagine a rebirth. But whether or not our church as we know it dies, creation needs the stories. So may we carry them faithfully and look toward an honest recognition of our aging institutions, and be honest about that, but ultimately understand the power of rebirth under the shadow of death. Death cannot stand up to our stories, says Leslie Skilko.
I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, so when we had to turn into little circles here, I'm the person who wanted to actually pick up my chair and tiptoe away, which is why I live on a dirt road at the end of a 750-meter driveway and look at bugs a lot. So what this gathering has called me toward is actually more human community in my life. It's been so hugely encouraging in that sense of having more courage to hear what all of you are doing and what folks on this panel are doing, and I feel called to building and maintaining those relationships in my work, since Ched's right. I talk about the stuff at academic conferences and 3 people might connect and the rest are like, oh, that's a little weird. So so this has been so nourishing for me. I have the privilege of preaching shortly, and that will be my call to you, so I'll stop now.
So we've got time for about 20-minute break, and we come back here at 11.